Okay, sorry about that. I forgot I've got these cut off after 15 minutes, so sorry about the little juxtaposition. But what we were talking about is the complexity of great, the complexity of America, even the complexity of again. Again implies an historical period, right? So what was the golden age? Was it in the 1920s? Was it, the 1860s? Was it the 1790s? Like, what are we talking about with the again part? In other words, when did America stop being great? And again, you're going to get a million different answers to that question, largely depending on the demographic, largely depending on how you understand America. And then the make part, well, how do you do that? What specific policies, what specific decisions will make us great again? Like, how do we do it? What's the plan? So in other words, again, I'm totally not picking on Mr. Trump. I swear to God, I'm just trying to show how any political statement might sound pretty easy and simple to understand. But when we break down each piece and we abstractly pay attention to the complexity of the whole, we understand that this is essentially meaningless. But it can be used as a political tool to make people come together. Because the whole thing is, this phrase means something different to everybody, yet they don't realize it. So everybody can support it, assuming that, well, he means what I think about America and what I think a great America is, and when it should come back to what period, and I know he's going to do the things I want him to. But nothing was specified. So when it comes, and that's just one little example, and I don't want to belittle it or beat a dead horse here, but I think you get the point. But the idea of thinking with abstraction, or thinking deliberately and critically and of the whole, is going to take a degree of habit. We're going to have to produce the habit of thinking with complexity, the habit of intellectual rigor. And like anything, right? You know how people say, well, I'm not good at math? There's a secret to being good at math, and that is by thinking mathematically. And how does one think mathematically? Well, there's only one way to think mathematically, and that is to imbue ourselves with the habit of thinking mathematically, which ultimately comes down to something simple, doing math. So, right, in other words, sort of a trick there. There is no silver bullet. The way to be good at math is to do math, because the more you do math, the more you put your brain into the habit of thinking mathematically. And when you're in the habit of thinking mathematically, then you're going to be good at math. So the being is the doing, and it all is about creating habits, habits of thinking. And so we can have the habit of thinking complexly, or we can have the habit of thinking simplistically. And in a great book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, which we'll talk about later, he understands that the complex thinker is the leader, whereas the simplistic thinker is the manager or the worker. And there's a huge difference between this. The simplistic thinker, right, when we're talking about Ivy League and all that kind of stuff, is one who works on simple rules, right, who would take something like Make America Great Again and understand it in a very simple way. Whereas the true leader is the person who thinks about the complexity of a situation, who is in the habit of abstracting out of the simple, so as to be able to appreciate the full whole of something, right? And that's why there are leaders, because they understand the whole. And they delegate or designate management operations to those who don't understand the whole. Now, that doesn't mean that, studying philosophy is going to make us all presidents. I'm not saying that at all. However, to be a good citizen in a republic, we should be able to appreciate the complexities of any issue. Because at the end of the day, to be a citizen is to abstractly think of oneself as a citizen, which means that you are equal to 350 million other people who are absolutely different than us. And all of these people are other perspectives. Well, if all we understand is our own perspective, okay, you're going to have to forgive me sometimes on my spelling because I'm going fast here, right? So there are other perspectives, many other perspectives. And the only way we can come together as a republic is if we appreciate these other perspectives and take them into consideration, because at the end of the day, a republic is nothing but compromise. Because if republic is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, we have to abstractly think about how complicated and complex the concept people is. Okay, so in other words, back to habit. So how does one engage in the habit of thinking complexly? Habit of complex thinking. Well, there is really only one way. And that is, guess what? Just like math, to think complex thoughts, right? We have to, in other words, practice, just like in math. We have to do the thinking. We have to deliberately become familiar with complex thoughts. And just like math is not necessarily like natural in the sense that, you know, it's something that we have to work at, right? Nobody, well, no, that's not true. Some people are probably born with more mathematical minds than others, but we can all achieve, you know, the ability to think mathematically as long as we habituate ourselves to do it, right? Likewise, complex thought. If we habituate ourselves through practice and familiarity with complex thoughts, then we'll become abstract, complex thinkers. And that's the true hallmark of an intellectual. And this is also the project of philosophy. Going back to our original, the whole point of philosophy is to create in people the habit of complex thinking, so that we can understand all facets of a problem or an issue or an idea. So we can understand and take into consideration all of the perspectives. Because now here's the thing, it might be a little bit disconcerting, because in philosophy, the more we pay attention to the whole, right, because the whole goes this way and that for a long time, right? And the whole takes into consideration all sorts of different opinions and perspectives. And the more we pay attention to the whole, the more we realize that, suppose this is all I know. My understanding of the whole is my opinion. Well, the more I open myself up to a broader whole and a broader whole, etc., the more I realize that not one of these particular aspects is the truth, right? We begin to realize that truth itself is incredibly complex. And this can be disconcerting to a lot of people. And it takes time to get used to. Because ultimately what it means is that we can sort of become frustrated and disillusioned and think that there is no truth. Because indeed, if you look at different perspectives, you realize, holy Toledo, it's very difficult to assert that, you know, my opinion of something is the correct one. Especially in a republic where another citizen who's very different from me is nevertheless a citizen, and that person's perspective is as important and equal to mine, right? So just because, you know, that person's a Republican or that person's a Democrat, first and foremost, they're citizens, right? So anyways, when you put that all together, it can be very frustrating in philosophy. That is, the project of philosophy can bring with it disillusionment. However, at the end of the day, all we can do is come to a prudent and wise evaluation of the truth. And the way that we evaluate is to consider all of these aspects, right? The more we consider in making a decision, the more perspectives that we, put in under the umbrella, the more prudent and wise will be our evaluation. At some point, we're going to have to say, okay, this is the way we're going. You can't have an absolute compromise of all things, but you can have the most prudent and wise decision of what we're going to do, or what we're going to call truth. And that's the whole project of philosophy, and it takes habit. So in the next section, we're going to look at, well, how do we start the habit of complex thinking? And there's a great source we're going to look at from a guy named Descartes, who was a early modern philosopher. He's writing in the 17th century, late 16th, early 17th century. And he wrote a book, many of them, but one called Discourse on Method, in which he gave people advice on correct ways of thinking. It's sort of like tips for how to break down complex ideas, because in philosophy we are going to throw ourselves into complex ideas, but we're going to have to break them down into components so that we understand them and then build them back up. And so in our next little installment here, we're going to look specifically at Descartes' Discourse on Method. So before we do that, if you want to continue right away, call up the Discourse on Method. There is a URL in the course materials. Have that available, because I'm going to walk us through some of his advice.